Today, I'm going to show you how to paint your brand new Space Marines from the Leviathan set. The Leviathan box is a brand new starter set for 10th edition Warhammer 40k and contains everything two people need to have a great time. I will be painting my Space Marines as the bestest chapter and all of the Adeptus Astartes. And no, it's not the Ultramarines. My Space Marines aren't heretic Xeno lovers like Gilliman. Gross. I'm going to be painting the Retributor Space Marines from the Astartes movie. Okay, first thing to do is to throw away the bugs and get the models assembled. I had one of my lackeys, assemblers, Eric, do this for me. According to him, the models go together pretty well, and it only took about an hour to get everything done. So I'm trying to squeeze in the Leviathan box between some other commission projects, so I'm going to try to paint the entire box in 24 hours. I already have about a company size plus force of Retributors, and the paint scheme is fairly simple, so these really shouldn't take long at all. The Leviathan box only comes with 25 models, which really isn't even a challenge, so I'm going to add a few more units. Originally, I was going to add my Marines from the Astartes Strike Force box, but I don't know where I put it, so I added some heavy intercessors and the captain from the Pariah Nexus box instead. Also, an impulsor and a gladiator tank for good measure. I am totally not going to regret this decision later. For the color scheme, I'm going to be painting them pretty close to the scheme in the official art in the movies. I did go with a little bit more of a gray green, kind of like a World War II German gray green, to make these guys a little bit more interesting. Plus, I already have my Solar Auxilia and Steel Legion that are painted in normal, boring gray. I am also mostly following the color guide of the Astartes movie made, but with a little bit of variation that I will explain later. So, it was 6 p.m. when I started painting these. I started painting today at 9 a.m. and I've already been doing commission work for 9 hours, so what's another 24 hours of paint? The first color is Tamiya Black Green, which I sprayed directly onto the plastic because nobody has time for primer. Even though the Tamiya paints say they are acrylic, they really aren't. They're actually solvent-based paint, and with the magic of chemistry or alchemy or whatever, they work on plastic without primer. I'm covering the entire model with this just like it's a colored primer. This paint might look like it's going on pretty thick, but I thinned down Tamiya paints with Mr. Hobby Leveling Thinner because it also has some magic qualities that make the paint dry nice and even if you're spraying way too much like me. This step took about 20 minutes even with the filming, and then it was time for dinner. Back to painting, the first highlight is with Tamiya RLM Gray. This is also thin with Mr. Hobby Leveling Thinner, but with much more thinner than the last color. I can't really give a ratio since this will really depend on how your airbrush is set up and your spraying habits. You'll just have to do some trial and error. This color goes all over the helmet, shoulder pad, backpack bits, bottom of the chest plate, knees, thigh armor, elbow, hands, and the feet, with a little bit going up the bottom of the shin pad. Like most of the airbrushing I do, I'm trying to accentuate the armor rather than making it look like a realistic highlight, which would be kind of boring since the light just hits from the top. On the dreadnought on the vehicles, I'm fading the highlight up the armor panels using the Sensei Swag masking tool to get a very sharp highlight. This step ended up taking about half an hour. The last highlight is Zone of IJN Gray. This is focused on just the forehead, chest plate, knee pad, feet, hands, the outside of the backpack, plus a little circly thing in the center on the back of the backpack. On the vehicles, it's the same process as the last color, but only just a small tiny bit to get the sharp transition between light, medium, and dark. This helped the vehicle looks a little bit more three-dimensional, kind of like a sketch of a cube. Now time to airbrush our special boys. I did the shoulder pads in the same green as the last few steps, but the Apothecary and the Librarian are white and blue respectively, and I'm going to airbrush these colors to save time. To keep the green, I'm covering it with liquid mask. I ran out of the purple Humbrol one that I like to use, and whichever one this is also fine. Most of these masking fluids dry clear, so I put on 2 or 3 coats to make sure everything is covered. The Humbrol brand is purple, so it's actually easier to know that you got everything. Then I primed the 2 models in black. Any black primer like Vallejo or Pro Acro will work. If you're in the EU, the AK Interactive one-shots are pretty good, but they're much harder to find here in the States. While I had black in airbrush, I also painted the Special Infantry. On the style guide, you can see that the regular Tactical Marines are just green, and then the Special Devastator and Assault Marines have black shoulder pads and helmets, while the Veterans and Command figures are white. I did do this a little bit differently with the Primaris Marines and painted the special armor variants like the Aggressor suits and the Flying suits black instead of dividing it in between Battle Line, Close Support, and Fire Support. I think that the heavier variants will look a little bit better and stand out more rather than just having a basic Assault Intercessor have more drip. The next step was to work on the white. To save time, I'm going to paint the Apothecary at the same time as the details on the Veterans and the Terminators. I want a cooler looking white to contrast with the warm weathering, so I'm going to start with a dark blue-gray. I airbrushed this color onto the shoulder pads and the helmets of all the Veterans and Commanders. If you don't think you can airbrush this color, it's perfectly fine to paint it by hand. After the small sections are done, I sprayed the Apothecary with the same color. Highlighting time. I used a lighter blue-gray to airbrush some highlights onto the armor the same way as I did the gray. You can mix some of this with white 50-50 with the last color. You shouldn't be worried about splashing the paint around, so I use the same color to highlight the helmets and shoulder pads on the Terminators, Stern Guard Veterans, and the Commanders. If there is a little bit of overspray, you can clean it up later. Finally, I use pure white as a final tiny highlight on the white parts. This goes on just the top of the shoulder pads and the foreheads on the Special Marines, and the Apothecary gets a little bit more on any part that I want to stand out a little bit. Then I highlighted the black on the heavy intercessors with the dark gray. Same as before, and I just need one highlight, but you can add a second highlight of a lighter gray if you want. Now it's time to do the same thing, but with the Librarian. I started with a very dark blue and left some black in the recesses just to make the blue look a little bit deeper. So I'm mapping out the light and dark areas right now so I can see where I want to put the highlights in the next step. The next step is a medium blue, and this is used as a mid-tone. It should take up between 50 and 75% of the darker blue, depending on what parts and how much fading you want. So I focus this on the highest points of the armor with some artistic changes and highlighted certain parts of the model just to give it a little bit more contrast. To finish off the blue, I use a very light sky blue. This color is very strong, so I just put a tiny dot on the blue parts that I wanted to have the brightest highlights. If you did the last few steps correctly, the blue should have a nice fade on every panel, and everything will be tied together after the weathering is done. Alright, done with the airbrush for now, so I removed the masking fluid. I'd use my fingers for this and kind of rolled it off the shoulder pads, but if you're having trouble, use a hobby knife to cut some of the masking fluid away and use tweezers to lift the fluid off the model. Depending on what brand of masking fluid you're using, you might only have an hour or so before it hardens completely on the model, so get this done. I recommend you not leave it overnight. After all the airbrushing was done, I sealed the models with gloss varnish to get ready for decals. I was hopping in between projects painting these guys, and after spraying everything, it was already 1 a.m. and I had been painting for 15 hours, so I decided to go to sleep and start again in the morning. Alright, it's the next morning, and for once, I let the spray paint dry overnight as the instructions recommend. Time to bring them upstairs and slap on some decals. First, we need to cue up some music, like 50/50's Cupid, to get the day going. Also, shot a clock because I only slept for a few hours. I started getting all the decals prepped, but I realized I forgot some steps last night. The first was the capes on the 2 commanders, so I hand painted these black to prepare for airbrushing. The paint looks a little bit thick in the video, but I did mix a lot of thinner, so it should kind of level out when it's dry. Next, I airbrushed the dark red onto the cape. I'm not sure if you can leave this part off because I didn't assemble it, but if you can, it would be easier to paint the cape while it is not on the armor. I just broke the model off the base. The dark red should cover most of the cape, leaving some black shadow in the deepest folds. You can clean up any mistakes with thinner like I did here, and since you varnished on the previous step, there should be no chance to damage the paint underneath. The first highlight on the cape is done with normal red. This is focused on the high points on the outside of the folds. I put the PSI on the airbrush pretty low, and there's a lot of thinner to mix in there to get the paint to... I put the PSI on the airbrush at a pretty low number, and there's a lot of thinner mixed into the paint to get the smooth fade. The last highlight is orange. This goes on just the top of the fold. The color should be less than 1/3 of the red. You don't want to cover up too much of the last two colors, otherwise the cape will read as orange instead of reading as red with the bright highlights. So I glued the captain back onto the base, and it's time for decals. I did gloss varnish the capes first since I wanted to use decals on them. Alright, actually not really decal time yet. I found another spot, I forgot. Some of the scroll work and purity seals will get decals also, so I had to block these in with a dark ivory. Whatever has good coverage like Puracryl's dark ivory is good, and I'm going to be highlighting it at a later stage. Okay, decals, for real this time. Since James Workshop doesn't like money, they don't make decals for the most beloved of all of the Emperor's Space Marines, so I'm using the totally not Retributor decals made by Mighty Brush. Also, not sponsored, but these decals are awesome, and the only thing better than their decals is their customer service. Me, being the cheap Asian that I am, ordered decals for this project and paid for the cheapest shipping that did not even have tracking. I ordered these decals back in January of this year, and the Brits decided to do the most American thing they've ever done and go on strike. I think some postal workers probably threw the decals away because I never got them after 3 months. Mighty Brush immediately sent me out another set of decals with tracked shipping for free. And it's not like they just replaced one sheet. I ordered some decals for some other projects, and they sent me about another $100 in product. Highly recommend. Anyways, decals. If you want a more in-depth explanation of how I do these, look at my Imperial Knights painting video. The Retributors get the chapter icon on the left shoulder pad and their tactical designation on the right shoulder pad along with the squad number. On the Special Veteran Boys, I added some Gothic script, battle honors, and other stuff to make them look a little bit fancier. I did skip the forehead marking on the style sheet because I thought it was a little too much on the models. I put that on the back of the backpack instead. I didn't film the next part, but after the decals are done, I used matte varnish to seal everything in, and it was a good base layer for the rest of the hand painting. I don't know where the footage for this part went, but I base coated all of the metals in gunmetal. Then I painted all the gold details with Retributor gold from Citadel. This goes on the chest eagle along with any of the markings and honors and the other little bits like the Crux Terminatus. Some of the characters also got gold details on their shoulder pads or helmets. Next, I'm using dark ivory to base coat the rest of the cloth or parchment areas like the purity seal, ribbons, and the dick cloths. This step will usually take 2 thin layers since the color is really light. I recommend the Pro Acro color since the Citadel paints end up usually taking 3 or 4 layers. After that, I painted the wax on the purity seals with red. I also painted some of the exposed cables this way just to add a little bit more detail and color on the models. Another small detail, but I added yellow to the tip of the nissels. Usually I paint these red, but there's already enough red on the models and the lenses will be red also. The yellow actually goes pretty well with the gold and the company icon that is on some of the vehicles. And it was at this step that I failed my 24-hour painting challenge. I didn't have time to make food, so I ran out to Macca's to get lunch and got food poisoning or something, but I was in bed and in the restroom and unable to paint for the rest of the day. Okay, it's now Sunday and I felt better, so it's time to get these boys finished up. I wanted to add some texture and distressing on the armor. I probably should have done this on the third step before I painted on anything else, but this is just a dry brush of Nurgling green. I use a flat brush and wipe off the paint off the brush and apply it to the sharpest edges of the armor. Now the armor has some texture and it doesn't look as smooth. I also do this on the vehicles to get the hard lines on the armor and the details like the rivets. For the characters, I'm edge highlighting them in the traditional method just to make them pop a little bit more compared to the regular basic bitch infantry. This is done on the highest points of the armor. You can do this on all the models, but I don't have time for that. I'm also highlighting the Apothecary and Librarian the same way. For the Apothecary, I'm using pure white. Now you can really see all of the details on the armor. On the Librarian, I'm using the lightest blue color that I airbrushed on earlier. This step does take about 10 minutes to model, and it's more time than I usually like to spend on a normal infantry guy. If you do want to see how I can paint a whole model in 10 minutes, check out the Death Corps of Krieg painting video. Now it's time to finish the base coats with a medium brown. I painted this color all over the pouches, belts, and straps. You could do this in black, but I chose brown since I wanted a little bit more color on the model. Find a brown that covers in one coat like Mornfang brown or a better version from Pro Acro. I wanted the gold on the model to really pop, so I'm highlighting all of it with an edge highlight using chrome. This will give the gold some dimension after the weathering step when finished. I put this color on the hard edges like with the other highlights and just on the tip of the wings on the chest plate. Oh wait, one more highlight. Since the dick cloths take up so much real estate on the models, it makes sense to give them a quick highlight. I just use a lighter bone or ivory color and paint it on the most raised parts just to give them a little bit more depth. I also painted this color on some of the folds on the purity shields. Well, all the base coats are done, and here's how the boys look before weathering. Oh, I forgot to paint the brass bits, so here's that. This color mostly goes on the flamethrowers, on the Totally Not Intercessor Marines, and a few other small details like the rounds in the magazines, and just wherever. Last little bit I also forgot is this dark gray that I painted in the joints of the Space Marine suits. I chose a dark gray instead of black so that the recesses can get darkened down during the weathering while the highest details are still exposed. Alright, weathering time for real. I wanted a darker look on these guys, so I'm going with Shrieking Grime for Panzer Gray, which is a little bit darker and cooler than the normal shade of Shrieking Grime that I use. I mix this with some Gamsol at about 50-50, but play around with the ratio to see what works best with your airbrush setup and paint style. I airbrush this all over everything. No need to be careful at all. This goes over everything, and even the vehicles are completely covered. The Shrieking Grime needs a few hours to dry, and it's Sunday, so it's time for some religious observance. I would like to apologize in advance for the 16% of my audience from Great Britain for this next part.
Hey, 3, 2, 1, let's go. Yes.
Okay, back to painting. I need to remove most of the Shrieking Grime, and I use a makeup sponge and drag this down the model to get some streaking effects for extra texture on the armor. I do the same thing on the infantry, and for some spots where the grime has really dried up, I use a sponge dampened with Gamsol to loosen up the paint. On some of the characters, I need to use a Q-tip to get some hard to reach areas. This step took about 45 minutes, and now the models are looking suitably grimdark. The armor looks dirty, but I wanted it to also look a little bit damaged and distressed too. I use a sponge from one of those weird craft brushes, but you could also use some leftover sponges from blister packs or an army case. I ripped a small piece and used a hobby knife to cut the tip up a little bit. The first color of chipping is a dark brown black. I dipped the sponge into this and dabbed it onto a paper towel until I got the pattern that I liked, and applied it on the model, focusing mainly on the sharp edges where the armor is more likely to be damaged. I'm going to do a multi-stage chipping, and this color represents the oldest chips that have dirt or are rusted. The next color is gunmetal. I applied this exactly the same way as the other color, but put a little bit less onto the model. The color has quite a strong effect, so don't overdo it. I put a lot of it on the areas that already had black-brown to make the armor look more three-dimensional. Last color is a bright silver. These are the freshest chips that haven't had a chance to get dirty like the older ones. This is the brightest color on the model, so I just used a tiny bit. I also added a small bit onto the brass and gold areas just to add some more damage to those areas. To finish off, I painted the eye lenses in chrome. I'm not really a big fan of the gem effect that most people do for eyes, since I don't think this is realistic looking. It's definitely more of an artistic effect, so go with whatever you prefer. I filled the chrome areas in with transparent red to get a glassy glowing red effect. This might take a few coats on the bigger parts, so just be patient with this. I forgot to do this step when I painted my Astartes a while ago, so now it's a good time to get these finished up for good. Basing time. I covered this in better detail in the last video on painting the Legio Ignatum Titans, but I'm using my poor man Sterling mud, which is just all of the normal materials that you would normally use on a base, but all mixed together. Instead of glue, then sand, then paint, and a lot of drying and waiting in between, I just mix it all together. And some tactical rocks to make the base look extra cool. While the base was drying, I painted the flesh on all of the characters. I'll go over my skin painting method in a new video, but at this point I just want to get the models done, and it's super hard to paint this while looking through the screen of a camera. And no way I could film painting the eyes or lips looking at a digital screen. So next time I'll have somebody else film over my shoulder while I paint. Bases are dry, so now it's time to add pigment. Again, go to the Legio Ignatum video for a more in-depth explanation about this method, but I just use a light pigment color and a darker pigment color to make the ground look dusty and not look like painted sand. The pigment is super fine and it looks like dirt at this scale. Everything is sealed with Gamsol and the bases are done. And for the last part, all you need to do is give all the boys a good rim job with black and we're done. Be careful airbrushing this because you don't want to get paint splatter all over the feet. Just use a paintbrush if you aren't comfortable with the airbrush. And they're done. The Retributors are ready for 10th edition. I really enjoyed painting these models. They look so much better than the Space Marines that I first painted in 4th edition when I got into the hobby. And I'm very happy that Terminators are back and they're no longer short Marines. Time to add these guys to the rest of my Retributors. Now it's finally looking like a full army. Originally, I just wanted a company of 100 models, but James Workshop keeps finding a way to take more and more of my money. I'm almost at 2 companies now, and I have a few dozen more Marines in my pile of shame, and I think at this point, I should just go paint a full chapter. Let me ask my financial advisor if he thinks that's a good idea. Alright, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I'll do my best to get back to you. A few more videos coming soon. The Imperial Navy video is almost done, and I'm about to start the Legio Gryphonicus Titan Maniple. One more thing. If you watch this entire video and you decided that you don't want to paint your miniatures, maybe because it looks too complicated, or you just don't have enough time, we got you. Sensei Swag Mini Art offers a few different levels of painting, ranging from battle ready at just $10 a model, up to competition level pieces. Our studio is based in the United States, but we do send models all over the world. For more information, please visit www.senseiswagminiart.com. The first 5 people that mention this ad get 10% off of their new commission. Okay, bye.